In this video, you're going to learn about ES6 promises. These promises are going to allow us to do something after a long-running task completes. A long-running task like setting data in the Firebase database. So we're going to explore the Promises API in isolation, then we'll see how we can use the exact same API over here to do something when our set call either succeeds or when it fails. I'm going to create a new file in the playground folder to mess around with promises. We can call this one promises.js. Now currently this file won't actually run, so let's go ahead and make sure to import it temporarily. Over in app.js, I'm going to import it. From the current directory, we need to go into the playground directory. In there, we have promises. Now the file will actually run and we can add some code inside of here. The easiest way to explore the Promises API is to just create our own promise and start messing around with it. So let's go ahead and do just that. I'm going to make a const promise. I am going to set it equal to, and right here, we're going to make a new promise using the new keyword with the promise constructor function. Now we do have to pass an argument right inside of here. This is a function. And in here, this is where we do our long-running asynchronous task. So maybe we're making a request to a server, we're trying to trigger a Firebase data change, we're looking for a file in the file system, we're trying to take a picture with a webcam. It could be any sort of long-running task, any sort of asynchronous JavaScript. When it's done, we go ahead and call one of two functions, depending on whether it went well or whether it did not go well. Those two functions are provided for us right here, resolve and reject. If we call resolve, that means, hey, this thing went well, we got the data or whatever we happen to be doing. If we call reject, it is going to alert the person that, hey, something did go wrong, here is the error. So at this point, we're going to ignore a lot of the details, and all I'm going to do is call resolve, and I'm going to pass in anything I like. In this case, I'm just going to pass in a string. This is my resolved data. So at this point, we have a completely valid promise that we can start using. Now, most of the time, these promises are going to be created for us, which means we're really not going to see this code a whole lot in our actual projects. Code like this lives inside of the Firebase library. What we're going to be doing is using a lot of promises that get generated by method calls like set. So when we do have something, we do have a promise, how exactly do we do something when it either succeeds or fails? To do that, we have to access the promise and we have to register some callbacks. Right here on our promise, we're going to call .then. .then lets us register a callback. That callback is going to fire when and if the promise resolves. So right here, I will pass in a function and I'm going to have access to any data that might have gotten passed to resolve. So I can just name that data and log it out. Console.log data. So at this point, we have created a promise that resolves some data. We have also waited for things to complete. And when they do complete, all we do is dump the data to the screen. I'm going to go ahead and save the promises.js file, switch over to the browser and take a look at the output in the console. Right here, we see that right away we do get our message. We get our message, this is my resolved data showing up. So the data is at least flowing correctly, but it's not exactly the most meaningful thing in the world. So let's go ahead and make this example a little more real world. To simulate some sort of arbitrary delay, we're going to be using set timeout. So we're going to force the promise to wait a second and a half before it actually resolves. To mess around with this, what we're going to do is add a call to set timeout. This is in the basic JavaScript API. We pass in those two arguments. The first one is a function to run. The second one is the number of milliseconds to wait before running it. And I could go ahead and toss in 1,500, which would be 1.5 seconds. Now, what do I want to do after 1.5 seconds? I want to add my resolve call. So I'm going to cut that out from here and paste it in right there. Now we're going to see a delay between when this code runs and when the console.log prints. I'm going to add a console.log right here. Before, then I'll add another one down below, console.log after. We can go ahead and save the promises file and see exactly what happens. So it is going to go ahead and restart. Right here, we're getting before and after, and then 1.5 seconds later, we got this is my resolved data. If you want to see that in a little more dramatic fashion, we could change this over to 5,000 milliseconds, and that would take a full 5 seconds before this message ever showed up. I'm going to save things again. It refreshes. We get before and after, and we don't get another message. 5 seconds later, though, it does show up. So what exactly is going on here? First up, our console.log runs. It prints before to the screen. Then right here, we attach something that basically says, hey, when that promise completes, go ahead and run this function. But it's not going to sit here and wait for the promise to complete. We've already registered the callback. So it's going to allow the program to move on. We print after, and then we just sit and wait. We wait those 5 seconds. Eventually, the promise does resolve, and our callback does indeed fire. So using this technique, we're going to be able to do all sorts of interesting things, especially with Firebase. We're going to be able to fetch data and wait for the data to come back and do something with the data, for example. And the same thing is true when writing data. We can start the process of writing the data and do something when Firebase says, yes, the data was written successfully. Now, if we wanted to, we could add another promise.then call down below. I could take this one and paste it down below, and now we're just attaching 2 callbacks. This one says, hey, run me when the data comes back. This one says, hey, run me when the data comes back. So right here, I'm going to add a first argument on. I'll just toss 2 in front. Then up above, I will toss 1. We can go ahead and save things once again, and we can view what this does to the output over inside of the browser. So over here, it is going through the process of refreshing. We get before and after, then we get nothing. And 5 seconds later, we get both of our messages. We get this is my resolved data for 1 and for 2. So you can actually do as many things with that promise as you like. The one thing to note, though, is that a promise can either be resolved or rejected. You can't resolve and reject a promise, and you can only resolve or reject a single time. So let's go ahead and remove this second promise.then call. And up above, we're going to add another call to resolve. I'm going to call resolve again, and I'm going to pass in some data. This is my other resolved data. Now, when we do this, you might think, hey, this callback would run twice, right? We resolve with this data, then with this data. But the Promises API was not designed for this. Your promise is either resolved or rejected. When it is resolved or rejected, it can never be resolved or rejected again, which means that this is going to get completely ignored. It might as well not even be here, and we can prove that. If I save the promises.js file, the browser is going to refresh, and when it comes back, we're going to see exactly what we get. We get before and after. We wait our 5 seconds, then we get our message just a single time. The other message is never going to show up because the promise is ignoring this other resolve call. So we can resolve a single time, and it's important to note you can only pass a single argument to resolve or reject. So in this case, I pass a string. I could not pass on 2 arguments like other and then try to name that down below and access it. This isn't going to work. We can resolve a single value. If you do need more than one piece of information, just go ahead and resolve an object. So I could pass an object to resolve, and I could have many properties on here. I could have name equal to Andrew and age equal to 26. Now I would have access to both of those down below on data. If I go ahead and save things, we can dump the data to the screen, and we should see our resolved object. We should see both of those properties, and we can access both of them in whatever way we happened to want to. Right here, we wait 5 seconds, and we get all of that data back, which is a great step in the right direction. Now, at this point, we've only ever resolved a promise. When we resolve a promise, we're saying, hey, the thing that we expected to happen, it happened. So you said, I want to start writing data. The data was written. You said you wanted to fetch the weather from this API. The weather was fetched. But things also go wrong. When things do go wrong, we use reject. So I'm going to comment out this resolve call right here, and I'm going to add in a reject call. Now, reject follows the same rules. You can only call it a single time. You can only call it with a single argument. So let's go ahead and call reject with an error. Reject. And we'll just use a string error message. Something went wrong. Not particularly useful, but it will get the job done. Now we can go ahead and save the promises file and see what happens. The browser is going to refresh. We're going to get the before and after message. Then we just wait our 5 seconds and cross our fingers. What happens after 5 seconds? We do not get our console.log. This only fires when the promise is resolved. Instead, what we're getting is an actual JavaScript error. Uncaught in promise. Something went wrong. So we have our error message right here, and we have an uncaught JavaScript error. Now we don't want a whole bunch of JavaScript errors getting thrown. We want to do something specific when that happens. Maybe we want to try the request again or show a message to the user. To actually do something when your promise does get rejected, all we do is we add on right here after then a call to catch. We add this call on to catch, and catch is very similar to then. It gets called with a single function. This function fires when the promise rejects, and we do get access to that data. In this case, an appropriate name would be something like error, though we could call it anything we like. Now we can do something with this error. I could try the request again. I could print the error message to the user in the browser. For now, we're just going to console.log it. I'll console.log the static string error, :space, then I will just dump the variable to the screen. Now we can save the file again and see what happens. We're still going to wait those 5 seconds, and the promise is still going to get rejected, but this time around we shouldn't have that JavaScript error anymore, and right here that is exactly what we have. We just have our message printing to the screen because we do have a catch handler set up, so the promise isn't going to be throwing JavaScript errors. We now have a way to do something when the promise resolves and when the promise rejects, and this is exactly what we were hoping to do with our Firebase data. Now, before we go, there are a lot of alternatives to the promise syntax, and I just want to show you a couple real quick. First up, then it can actually take 2 arguments, 2 functions, and you can use this in lieu of catch. So I could take my catch function, cut it out, delete the catch method call, and just pass a second argument into then. If you do pass a second argument into then, this will be treated as your catch handler. If I rerun the code, we are still going to get that message showing up, even though we have never set up the catch method call. We get before and after showing up, and then 5 seconds later, we do get our message. Now, while this is perfectly valid, I find it a little more confusing than the explicit catch method. I'm going to undo those changes and bring us back to the version that does use catch. This just has clearer semantics based off of those method names, then and catch. They make a whole lot of sense. It's a lot easier to read a promise when it's structured like this. It's easier to follow the steps. So now we know the basics of promises. As I mentioned before, when we work with promises, about 99% of the time, we're going to be working with this side of things. Very rarely will we find ourselves creating our own promises. Most of the time, the promises are going to be created by the library you are using. For example, by a library like Firebase. What we're going to do is just attach handlers, things to run when the promise either resolves or rejects. And to wrap up this video, I do want to go ahead and do that for our firebase.js file. Over here, I am going to comment out. Actually, I'm going to remove the import for the promises file. We're not going to need that to actually run anymore. And over inside of Firebase, we're going to go ahead and try to add a then and catch method call onto one of these promises. Now the question is, where is our promise? What exactly should we be calling then and catch on? That's actually the topic of the next video, so let's just take a quick moment to recap what we covered in this one. In this video, we learned about promises, and promises are just a way to sync up our asynchronous operations. So we have this really long-running asynchronous task. We want to do something. When it completes, we can use promises to get that done. Now, in our case, we created a dummy promise that just waits 5 seconds, and then it resolves or rejects. Behind the scenes, though, Firebase has a much more complex setup, looking to see if the data was actually written, if the server could be connected to. All sorts of stuff goes into the Firebase promise. Now, the side that we're typically going to use is what we see down below. Down here, we have an existing promise, and we are trying to do something when it either resolves or rejects. If we want to do something when it resolves, we call then on the promise, passing in a callback function. We get access to the data, and we can do something with that data. If we want to add a handler for if the promise rejects, all we do is we call catch. Once again, we pass in a function. This function gets called if an error does occur. We get access to the error, and we can do something with it. Now that we have this in place, we're going to jump over to the next video and actually use promises right inside of the firebase.js file. I'm super excited to get to that, so let's switch over to that file, and I will see you in the next one.